Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. I'm Mark Stein in for Tucker this evening, but he will be here for a special appearance later in the show. But first, the continuing crisis on America's southern border and a new legal ruling that could have quite an impact. Jonathan Hunt has more.
Good evening, Mark. Thousands of Central American migrants are at the U.S.-Mexico border awaiting their chance to apply for asylum. Some are trying to circumvent what can be a lengthy process by crossing the border illegally where there isn't a checkpoint and then claiming asylum while already on U.S. soil. It is those would-be illegal immigrants that President Trump targeted in a November 9th proclamation, saying anyone who crossed the border between official points of entry would not be eligible for asylum. But the courts have again ruled against the president, with U.S. District Judge John Tigar, who was appointed by President Obama, writing, quote, "Whatever the scope of the president's authority, he may not rewrite the immigration laws to impose a condition that Congress has expressly forbidden." The Trump administration can appeal, and the case would likely be heard by the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which has already ruled against the president on a number of immigration issues, a fact clearly not lost on Mr. Trump, who berated the 9th Circuit as he left the White House for his Thanksgiving break today.
Well, you go to the 9th Circuit and it's a disgrace, and I'm going to put in a major complaint because you cannot win, if you're us, a case in the 9th Circuit.
Around 3,000 migrants from the caravan that originated in Central America have gathered in Tijuana on the Mexico side of the U.S. border. The Department of Homeland Security says there are around 500, quote, criminals among them, although it has not said specifically what each of their alleged crimes is. And on the U.S. side, 5,800 troops are now stationed to support Customs and Border Protection agents at an estimated cost of $72 million. According to the Pentagon today, and amid a certain degree of confusion as to how long those troops will stay and exactly what their mission is. Mark?
Thanks, Jonathan. Juan Hernandez is a former advisor to the Mexican president, Vicente Fox, and he joins us now. Juan, in what sense are these people in the caravan asylum seekers?
Well, I've met with many of them. I met with the 7,200 caravan in the state of Guanajuato that I now work for under the governor Diego Sinue, specifically working with immigrants, mostly Mexican immigrants living in the United States. But also it was my duty to make sure that we treated a humanitarian way these 7,200 that went through Guanajuato. And I'll tell you, you sit down with them for a minute and you're in tears. These are children, these are women. Let me finish. These are people looking for a better way of life, like your family and my family did many years ago coming to the United States.
Well, I don't know about you. I didn't come as an asylum seeker, but if I was an asylum seeker, this caravan has marched across two national frontiers. It marched into Guatemala illegally, and then it marched into Mexico illegally. If you're an asylum seeker, aren't you supposed to seek asylum in the first safe country you come to?
My friend, we all know the United States is today the most powerful nation in the world. It's the dream of many, many people who are just trying to get out of dire poverty, violence, to be able to reach the United States and to be able to be a blessing as they are the immigrants to this nation. That's the dream. They're coming to the United States and they're seeking asylum. They're not invading, and it's such a small number. We're talking about 10,000, 12,000 total, my friend.
No, but you're now saying that a dream is a basis for an asylum. I might have a dream.
Definitely.
I might have a dream to live in Barbara Streisand's house. It doesn't mean I have the right to go and move into her guest bedroom.
But if you're in the block away from her home and you're being attacked and you're being raped and your children, the only chance that they will have is to maybe join a gang, and you can't even feed them, you would be knocking on that movie star's home saying, is there some way that I could be here at your home and work for you?
Yeah, she still wouldn't let me in, Juan. You know that.
I know she would. She would, my friend.
Here's the other thing, though. You talk about all the children, there's women being raped. These are overwhelmingly young men. What kind of refugees, what kind of asylum seekers leave the old and the sick and their kids and their women folk back in Guatemala or wherever, and it's just the young men who come across the frontier? It's overwhelmingly young men.
Yes, probably about 75 to 80% are young men. You're right. They're the ones, back to our big dreams, they're the ones who want to do better for their families, and they're leaving desperately. They see no way that they can be able to survive in some of the places where they come from.
No, but just everyone with a dream. There's 7 billion people on the planet. And as you say, America's the most powerful, wealthiest, all the rest of it. Does that give 6.5 billion people the right to move to the United States?
It's not that it's the right. Those many would claim that it is a human right, that if you are in a dire situation, you're going to try, even if you have to break some administrative rules. They have not committed crimes. They are just seeking asylum.
You're now part of the state government in Mexico.
Yes, sir, proudly.
What's wrong with your state then? If they just want a better life, why can't they move to your state? Your state's better than Honduras, wherever they come from?
Yes, it is, but the dream for them was the United States. There's a wonderful article by Father Mello, a priest from Honduras, and he called it the boil over. I suggest that many of your viewers read it. I think it was New York Times came out, the translation. And he said that these were a people, they're not organized, they weren't paid by anyone. A few dozens were going to desperately just leave the country, and it just boiled over. Literally thousands said, we can take it no longer, we must seek a better life. And it's happening, you're right, all over the world. Today there are 250 million people going from one country to another, trying to find a better life. We have to deal with it. We must be a country of laws, and I'm speaking Mexico and the United States, but also countries that we're being tested, my friend, today. Other nations have not passed the test.
Well, wait a minute.
We need to pass this test of being humanitarian and give dignity to these people.
Why is it in the interests of other countries for all their most talented people to move to the United States or Western Europe? Why is it in why is it in the interest of Guatemala or anywhere else to be denuded of its most talented people?
Well, sure. It's mostly economic. In the United States, if you, and I'm sure you do, read the statistics, the United States is growing less than 1%. The United States needs about 350,000 new people every year. These 10,000 are good people. I met them. They went through our wonderful state of Guanajuato that, by the way, is doing great financially, but their dream is to come to the United States.
There's plenty of good people. If you go to these airport diners, by the way, you enter your meal order on a machine. Nobody needs people anymore. It's all automation. Juan, thank you for that. It is true. 30% of the world's going to be unemployed in a few years. So what's the real situation? Thank you, Juan. What's the real situation at the border, and what are agents actually having to deal with there as this caravan approaches? Tom Homan is the former acting director of ICE, and he joins us. We've seen dramatic scenes going on at the southern border, Tom, as this caravan prepares essentially to cross with impunity its third national frontier. What's going to happen?
Well, real quick, let me respond to Juan's comments. First of all, we're the most welcoming country in this world. We welcome more refugees in the United States than every other country in the world combined. So enough. And you can't want to be a part of the greatest country on earth and not respect our laws. Seeking a better life doesn't qualify for asylum. So they're committing fraud. So that's just a stone cold fact. What's going on the border, look, this president has got this nation ready. He's got additional CBP officers down there. He's got DOD down there. They have built extra infrastructure. They are building facilities to detain people, which is the secret. What this president needs to do, which hasn't happened in the past, is if they get to the United States and enter, they need to be detained until they see a judge. Because to Central American population is running around 89 to 91% will lose their case because they don't qualify for asylum. But they have to be in custody when they lose the case so they can be removed, which sends a strong message to the rest of the world that we are a nation of laws. We'll give you a due process, but you got to live by the judge's decision also.
Well, you say we're a nation of laws. We're getting government by judges. Judges have ruled that immigrants subject to deportation for being convicted criminals have a right to say goodbye. That's apparently in the Constitution. A judge has ruled he stopped the deportation of 1,400 Iraqi nationals who were committed of crime. Another judge struck down Trump's travel ban because foreign nationals apparently have an affirmative right to visit their relatives in the United States. In other words, aren't the courts actually making a mockery of any effective immigration or asylum enforcement?
They absolutely are. In the 3 cases you just mentioned, I was the ICE director during all those cases. I mean, there's one guy, the first case, he had an order deportation. He had due process at great taxpayer expense, was order removed, but wasn't hit out. Then when we finally did find him to arrest him, the judge wanted him more time to say goodbye to his family. When he knew for years he had to leave.
Yeah.
But yes, especially
that's the constitutional right to a long goodbye. The judge managed to detect that.
Look, we're in a state right now, the ACLU just sued the Trump administration for the right for people to enter this country illegally and be able to claim asylum. The Ninth Circuit has lost their minds. And this is going to continue. This isn't so much about the rule of law, this is about an attack on the Trump administration. But when he did this asylum proclamation, he based it on the same general principle as what they call the travel ban. We won that in the Supreme Court. We'll win this. The problem is, until it gets to the Supreme Court, thousands and thousands and thousands of more caravans going to come because of this ruling.
Thanks a lot, Tom. You're right on that. As we mentioned, activist judges aren't just out of control on immigration or inventing rights for Central American migrants. Today, federal judge Mark Goldsmith ordered the release of more than 100 criminal immigrants from Iraq. Some of these guys committed crimes as severe as assault and even murder. And so Iraq doesn't want them back. That's too bad then, because as Judge Goldsmith has ruled, the government can't even hold them. They have to let them go back into the community. Increasingly, the rule for judges seems to be blocking any deportations at all, even for convicted murderers. And speaking of the battle between the Trump administration and the legal system, President Trump has submitted his written answers to questions posed by the Mueller investigation. The president's attorneys say the questions Trump answered related to Russia, and Rudy Giuliani has said the president's cooperation with the investigation is unprecedented. He's called for a quick end to the investigation. We're going to have more on that with Brit Hume in just a moment. Also, Democrat Stacey Abrams lost Georgia's gubernatorial election fair and square, but she won't concede. Is this the new normal from the Democrats? Brit Hume's going to talk about that also. And have no fear, Tucker is here. He'll be making a special appearance tonight, right here on Tucker Carlson Tonight. All that coming up. One final battle still to be fought in the midterms and the U.S. Senate, this time in Mississippi. Republican Cindy Hyde-Smith is running against Democrat Mike Espy. And normally this should be a slam dunk for Republicans, but the race is suddenly in doubt. To investigate why, elections expert, Independent Women's Voice senior fellow Lisa Booth. She's been
I like that, elections expert.
Well, you've been doing all the midterms, and it's 3 weeks after Election Day, but the midterms are still on. Why is Mississippi in trouble?
Well, that's my background working in politics over the years. Well, look, it's competitive because there was a jungle primary, and Cindy Hyde-Smith, who is the Republican incumbent there who's running for re-election, nobody reached over the 55% threshold. So now we are in this runoff November 27th. There you see on the screen Mike Espy is the Democrat, a former agricultural secretary, and then Cindy Hyde-Smith, as I mentioned, who's the incumbent, will face off then. Democrats are really drawing attention to some recent comments that Hyde-Smith has made, and so that's what they're kind of honing in and focusing on. However, I don't know if this race will end up being as competitive as people are trying to make it out to be. Remember, there were two Republicans that ate up a lot of that vote. Right. You had Hyde Smith, who was the leader, not reaching the 50% threshold, but you also had Chris McDaniel eating up over 16% of the vote. So without him in the picture, you can see how her chances are a lot better off on November 27th.
So you don't think there's anything to this theory that a lot of formerly red states are starting to purple a little? That's the Democrats' theory on how Texas, Georgia, and maybe even Mississippi, in the medium term, an election cycle or two down the road, and things favor them.
Well, we'll find out in 2020. I mean, it's really hard to tell. This was just a bad election cycle for Republicans. I mean, I remember in 2009, Time magazine did a cover and said, endangered species for Republicans. And then Republicans went on to win the House, 63 seats they netted in 2010. And then 2012, Republicans did this autopsy report. They're in so much trouble for winning the White House. Go back to win the Senate in 2014, the White House in 2016. We just don't know. Maybe 2020 is a terrible year for Republicans. We don't know that. So I don't think we can really draw the conclusion that somehow Republicans are in trouble in the South. We'll find out on November 27th what happens in this race, though. Maybe that proves me to be wrong. But I do think with Chris McDaniel no longer being on the ballot there in just a Republican versus Democrat race, Republicans will come home for Hyde Smith.
Okay, well, you'll be back to tell us about that, Lisa, November 27th, Mississippi. Thank you, Lisa. It only took 10 days, but Stacey Abrams has finally admitted she's lost Georgia's gubernatorial race. Despite that, she's not actually conceding. And instead is claiming the election was illegitimate because it happened to produce the wrong winner.
It was not a free and fair election. It was not fair to the thousands who were forced to wait in long lines. It was not fair to the thousands that were put on hold with their registrations.
Is he the legitimate governor-elect of Georgia?
He is the person who won an adequate number of votes.
But you're not using the word legitimate. Is he the legitimate governor-elect of Georgia?
He is the legal governor of Georgia.
Fox senior political analyst Brit Hume joins us. Brit, the Democrats seem to be taking the view that this guy is like, I don't know, Hosni Mubarak or Colonel Gaddafi. He didn't really win the thing.
This is how this works, Mark. If you're a Democrat and you complain, no matter how unfounded your complaint may be, about the results of an election while you're a patriot, I've seen her styled in some places as a class act when you complain about the result of an election and claim that it was rigged or whatever. If you're a Republican in Florida, however, and you complain about the documented, court-confirmed irregularities in 2 counties down there, why, you're undermining democracy. Now, if that sounds to you like a double standard, I would suggest that that's exactly what it is, and the hypocrisy is remarkable. And don't forget this. Donald Trump wins the election in 2016, and we have heard no end of complaints that was rigged and set up for him in a plot of collaboration with the Russians, and with still people who cling to that theory, that conspiracy theory, to this day.
Right.
So it's okay if you're a Democrat to complain, but if you're a Republican,
Democrats don't actually seem to accept the legitimacy of any Republican victory. In the end, what they're doing is actually undermining the entire faith in the legitimacy of U.S. elections, aren't they?
Well, that is certainly the complaint that they always lodge when Republicans complain, but heaven forfend, you see, that we would ever suggest that that's what they're doing. But I think in the case of the Georgia election in particular, that their complaints are especially unfounded. And if you look at the complaints sort of point by point, you find that the things that were done that took certain people off the voter rolls were mandated by law. Right. If you do the signature check that they have to do, that is likewise a matter of law. There's nothing irregular about the way that election was handled that has been in any documented in any serious way, and yet here she is complaining to huzzas from her side of the aisle about the legitimacy of the election. It's just and I think it. My view of this is that the complaint is so lame that it probably won't do very much damage to people's faith in democracy, but it's out there anyway.
Well, speaking of faith in democracy, you mentioned that here we are 2 years on. they're still investigating officially the 2016 election. And today, the president finished his answers for Robert Mueller. Does that mean that Mr. Mueller's investigation is drawing to a close?
Well, one would think that this would represent a final stage now, and I think that the Mueller team has been waiting to see what kind of answers it could get President Trump to answer for quite some time, and this appears to be it. Now, I suppose it's theoretically possible that they could look at these answers and say, well, wait a minute, this opens up a whole new line of inquiry, and they will insist on doing that. You know, these independent counsels or special prosecutors, when that was still the case, do tend to go on for as long as they want with whatever budget they need. And of course, the clamor in Washington now is the fear that this new acting attorney general will rein that investigation in. My hunch is that the investigation is probably very near a conclusion. And you know, Mark, this investigation has been widely mischaracterized on all sides. You often hear it said that, well, the purpose of the investigation was to determine if there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Actually, that is a subset of what the investigation was supposed to be about. It originated under James Comey as a counterintelligence investigation to determine what exactly the Russians did to try to influence the election. And that was its principal purpose, with the collusion allegation being a piece of that, but not the main event. So I think what we're likely to hear from Mueller is a report that will go into quite some detail about exactly what the Russians did, which could be very useful to know.
Yeah, as long as they manage to finish it before the Russians steal the 2020 election. I mean, at a certain point, things just become theoretical.
Before the 2020 election is over.
Or 2024, yeah. Thank you, Britt. The Women's March was supposed to destroy President Trump. Instead, it's destroying itself. That's next. Plus, Tucker himself making a special appearance. All that just ahead on Tucker Carlson Tonight.
I'm a nasty woman. A loud, vulgar, proud woman. To our detractors that insist that this march will never add up to anything, you. Yes, I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
But it may be the Women's March movement itself that is blowing up. It was supposed to spearhead the anti-Trump resistance. Instead, it's devolved into a case of March madness. Women's March founder Teresa Shook is calling on Linda Sarsour, Tamika Mallory, and hosts with the group due to their support for the Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan and other anti-Semitic positions. Sarsour and her colleagues have dismissed Shook as irrelevant. Tammy Bruce is president of the Independent Women's Voice, and if there were a genuine Women's March, she should be leading it, in my view.
Well, there you go.
Tammy, what's going on here?
It's more than just anti-Semitism or Jew hatred. There's also a lot of apparently anti-gay sentiment that has arisen. Not unusual for the far left, of course. They're bigots, and that's the problem here. So it's also not unusual that this is happening at all, in that you've got the left traditionally does this. They co-opt important issues to a society that they're invading. They co-opt it, and then they write it to death. And right now, the Women's March clearly is not now about women's issues at all. They're complaining about white nationalism, white men. It's about race. And it's really just the carcass now of what was for a women's movement. And this is what the left does. And now it's a warning. This is not an isolated incident. It's beginning to try to move into the Democratic Party. And this should be a warning to everyone that identity politics, this is inevitably where it goes. Because in order to be proud of your identity, your personal identity, you've got to be better or different from someone else. And it invites the need for bigotry and for isolating the other individual who is unlike you.
Well, you said they're not just anti-Semitic, they're also anti-gay.
Yes.
Louis Farrakhan one of his many fascinating statements was that the Jew is responsible for the feminizing of the black man.
Oh, lovely.
Not that there's anything wrong with that, I don't think. But if there is, you don't want the Jews having a monopoly on it. I won't pretend to understand what he's getting at there. Linda Sarsour is a strong supporter of this. She's refused to back down.
Correct.
She's a great believer in Sharia, so there's no reason why she would have any particular interest in women's rights or gay rights or anybody else's rights. And likewise, Tamika Mallory is a big supporter.
Well, this is a classic hijacking, and there's could be I saw this emerging when I was in Now and on the left 25 years ago. The problem, and I have a lot of respect for Ms. Shook, but she's a retired lawyer, lives in Hawaii. The power of the internet. This started with a Facebook page, which is fabulous. I disagree with her on all of her issues that she's espoused on Facebook. But I have a lot of respect for saying this. She wants them all to resign, to step down, to try to save this movement. But of course, this will always occur unless you're there and ready to push back, because this is like a virus that occurs with the left, not just the American left, but around the world. This is what they do. They want to divide. They want to disrupt. And that's how they're doing it with this. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. At least for normal liberals, this is a kind of thing that you must stand up against, because otherwise it's going to consume everything that matters to you.
Well, you say normal liberals. Isn't it the case, Tammy, that at some point there's a reckoning that the identity politics coalition is basically incoherent? You know that in parts of Amsterdam and London, as those places have Islamized, the gay bars close and move out. That in the end, you got to pick and choose your identity politics, and maybe Miss Sarsour represents where the energy is in the Democrats.
Well, identity politics is inherently not a liberal position. Liberalism is about allowing individuals to live the lives that best suit them. You can't do that by identifying just based on an identity. It's got to be about ideas, right? And inspiration and values about for a larger society and culture. That's the classical liberal framework. That's the American sensibility.
That's like 50 years out of date in the Democrats.
Well,
though.
It is, but it exists with a base of liberals. I'm convinced of that, and you can still take your party back. I want a loyal opposition to the Republicans, because it makes the country better and stronger. And as a result, conservatism then would still prevail, because liberals wouldn't be afraid of it, because they also want people to be free, and it takes money and success and the free market to be free.
Fabulous. That's Tammy's Thanksgiving's greetings to the U.S. Democratic Party.
And my cranberry sauce will get you right through everything.
The Democrats will be coming around to Tammy's for Thanksgiving. Tucker will be here after the break. He's going to talk to an Arizona sheriff about Mexico's role in the devastating heroin epidemic across America. That's next on Tucker Carlson Tonight. A judge today ruled that the federal government's ban on female genital mutilation is unconstitutional. Boy, those founding fathers provided for everything. 2 Michigan doctors and 6 others were charged with transporting girls as young as 7 across state lines for the procedure. But District Court Judge Bernard Friedman ruled that while the federal government may be able to force you to buy health insurance, it can't bar adults from scarring children in ways they will live with for the rest of their lives. America's war against drugs coming from Mexico is going to get far more difficult. The party's newly elected government is moving rapidly toward legalizing marijuana. Meanwhile, its highest court has struck down the country's law authorizing the military's deployment against the drug cartels. Mexico then could soon be far more tolerant of drugs and the cartels. Meanwhile, heroin, brought in overwhelmingly from Mexico, is killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. Tucker just spoke with an Arizona sheriff about the threat of Mexican heroin. Here's Tucker.
Opioids are killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. It's an epidemic. It's being driven in part by prescription drugs, but not only by prescription drugs. Also heroin more of it is being smuggled into this country than ever before, and almost all of that heroin is coming from Mexico across our porous southern border. Matt Thomas is the Deputy Chief of Police in Pinal County, Arizona, and he joins us tonight. Chief Thomas, thanks very much for coming on. Give us a sense, and this is something that's rarely discussed in Washington, but of the scale of opioid smuggling across our southern border into the United States.
Well, we've seen a significant increase since 2014. It used to be that Arizona, our southern borders, marijuana was the cash crop for the Sinaloan cartel specifically, that kind of is the main cartel for our state.
Yes.
And there was a significant shift starting in 2014 where the marijuana smuggling started to decline, and we started to see a significant increase in the smuggling of heroin, fentanyl, and methamphetamine.
Fentanyl, too?
Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, give us a sense, like large amounts, enough that they would help drive the epidemic that's killing so many Americans?
Oh, absolutely, especially the fentanyl, because such small doses are so lethal. And
right.
So that particular drug becomes a danger both for anybody that is using it, but our officers as well. We've had several exposures in our state where officers have been exposed to fentanyl, and then they've had to get the Narcan to help reverse the effects so that they don't die from the exposure. We've had citizens, same thing, they overdose on it because it's much stronger than heroin. So we have the heroin
yes.
problem, but now we're having the fentanyl problem, and that is becoming a bigger crisis for us because it's so dangerous, and we're seeing it's coming in the format of essentially fake pills. So what the cartels are sending up are what are being sold as oxy, but it's fake, and it has the fentanyl in it, and it's much stronger, more potent, and more dangerous.
So we just had on the screen, I don't know if you could see it, a video of drug tunnels crossing the border into the United States. How common are those in your county?
In our county, not common, because we're off the border about 70 miles, and the county is unique, being that we're off the border 70 miles, but it's open desert to the border. That's what kind of makes us more like a border county. But
right.
for the border counties in the state, Pima County, Cochise County, Yuma County,
yes,
very common, because the Sinaloans essentially are the masterminds behind those tunnels, and Arizona being predominantly Sinaloa cartel ran, very common to see tunnels throughout our state.
Do you think Washington, which is trying to respond to the opioid crisis that's killing so many people, do you think that in Washington lawmakers have a sense of where these drugs are coming from?
I think they have a sense of where they're coming from. I mean, they would have to have their heads buried pretty deep in the sand to not have a sense of that. After all these years, we kind of know where the source is, but I don't think they have a sense of the magnitude of what's coming across the border, how easy it is to get across the border, and how adversely it's affecting all of our communities. And you know, from the smallest rural community all the way up to your metropolitan areas, it's having a very negative effect. And you know, it's kind of our fault on the American side. We're the consumers. We've kind of created this problem, and it's a demand-driven thing.
Yeah, it would be nice to stop it. Thank you very much for telling us that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Mexican heroin, the caravan that never stops. A university is ordering students to avoid dangerous things like capital letters. The Liberal Sherpa will explain next.